Hear the reading from the book of Kings. So Ahab sent to all the Israelites and assembled the prophets at Mount Carmel. Elijah then came near to all the people and said, "How long will you go limping with two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." The people did not answer him a word.
And turning to the gospel, we read this day in the book of Luke, there at the 7th chapter. After Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. There a centurion had a slave whom he valued highly and who was ill and close to death. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, asking Jesus to come and to heal his slave. When they came to Jesus, they appealed to Jesus earnestly, saying, "This man is worthy of having you do this for him, for he loves our people, and it is he who built our synagogue for us." And Jesus went with them. But when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to Jesus, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you myself, but only speak the word, and let the servant be healed. For I also am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes. To my slave, 'Do this,' and the slave does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, "I tell you, not even in all Israel have I found such faith." When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. So end our lessons for this day. When a biblical prophet says, "How long are you going to go about limping?" those of us with artificial knees and hips and shoulders wince a bit. We know about limping. There are three things that I had to learn over the last 3 years. The first was how many people were going to look at my legs. It's not something that men are accustomed to. The second was how long it would take to get to where we wanted to be. We have an outcome. We want to get healthy. We want to be strong again. We want to do all the things that we used to do. But the day-to-day struggle is hard. It's not our routine. It's not normal for us. We're used to getting better in a week. And 3 years and multiple surgeries is a long time. It's like those of us coming back at this time of year from Florida and Indiana and South Carolina and North Carolina to central New York. There's a natural progression that happens when we read the biblical story from Advent to Christmas to Epiphany to Lent to Easter to Pentecost. But when you arrive after Pentecost and we're working our way to Advent, it's a strange cycle. How do we go from the one that we know is the resurrected Savior to working towards believing that he's coming in innocence for the salvation of the world? It's hard for us to go day by day and night by night and not follow after our own wishes, but to trust. Not to seek after what society tells us of putting your own needs first, but instead trusting that we will get better. The third thing I've learned is that my posture had accommodated to the way in which everybody else was doing things. After doing so many weddings here and stopping all the bridesmaids as they came up the aisle, I learned to pitch my uterus forward and walk on high heels to try to get them to walk right. After carrying so many babies around, I learned to pitch my shoulders back and to accommodate to walking that way, and it screwed everything up. And I had to learn to stand upright before they could do anything. And then had to learn to adjust my posture again based on the next surgery, and to adjust that posture again based on new realities. Always trying to get better, but always feeling as though it was off because we'd accommodated for so long. That is what the passage Larry read for us is really all about with Elijah. King Ahab, the king of all Israel, has married Queen Jezebel, and she encouraged them to accommodate. You can follow after God if you choose to. You can be circumcised, you can eat kosher, you can follow the Sabbath and not do anything on that day. You can follow all the different commandments. Or you can buy these fertility idols and worship the Baal and worship Asherus. And the added benefit is that the worship of fertility gods is kind of sexual and it's kind of exciting. And the people began to accommodate. And they began to fall away from following after God, Yahweh. And they began to do what each person desired in their own hearts. And they found life to be as they wanted it. Day after day, it was 80 to 90 degrees, and it never seemed to rain. But after 3 years, not raining at 80 and 90 degrees, it became a drought. After 3 years of drought, Elijah was sent to the people and said to them, "How long will you go limping about after your own desires and after God? Choose one or choose the other, but you can't limp in both directions at the same time." Elijah does what we never expect to happen in the Bible. It's what we expect to happen on the television. He declares the first reality show contest. On this side is one team, and on the other side is another team. On this side are 450 prophets of Baal. On the other side is Elijah. And Elijah invites all the people to pay attention, to come and to watch and to listen and to see what takes place. And then Elijah clears all the debris from the place where the sanctuary had been to worship God. And he takes giant boulders and sets them up to make an altar in that place for God. And then he digs a giant trench all about it, a trench all around the place, and then gathers together the wood for making an offering and stacks it carefully upon the altar. And he invites the people to pay attention and to listen. Last week we had a memorial here and shared the service with a Jewish rabbi. The rabbi from Syracuse described that in his congregation there are 900 families. And his struggle with those who worship in central New York is that on any given Sabbath, he can maybe get 30 families to turn out of 900 families. In a church in Syracuse a few years ago, there was a controversy, and the pastor came before the congregation on a Sunday morning and said, "People are staying away from working out our problems. People are hiding and not coming to tell the truth. If you're not here next Sunday, you're all going to burn in hell." And next Sunday, this church was full. I've wondered at different times about preaching like that. It's a whole lot different than love and compassion and forgiveness. But I always wonder what I'm going to say the second week after. We have lived in an anomaly. We've been very blessed as a congregation. Across the nation, across the world, churches like ours have been burying more people per year than they've been welcoming as new members. And we've been fortunate. Over these last 20 years, we've had 120 deaths. That's 6 per year. We've had 475 new members become part of the life of this church. We've had 275 baptisms, and we have 6 more scheduled for the month of July. We as a church have continued to have new people, new lives that we've reached out to, and yet the difficulty has been our commitments, that we try to do all the things we've been doing on our terms. We try to live our own individual lives and only come for an hour on Sunday once a month, and we can't have it both ways. It seems so simple that Elijah cleared the debris of the old sanctuary. How many of you remember when Gail Banks had one end of the narthex and my office was in the other end of the narthex because there was no middle to the church during renovation? When we had multiple different capital campaigns going on at the same time, because we'd started one campaign and did all the work the first year and had nothing to show for it in our additional campaigns. So we started the second campaign to be able to do that much more. And we accomplished all of it and paid it off in the next 3 years. And setting up the instruments for worship, it took a lot more work than what we thought it was going to be, and a great deal of cost. But 8 years ago, we paid off all of that debt so that we've been free to do whatever we could choose to do. The constant challenge before the church is not to just worship on Sunday morning, but where are the new challenges? Where are the new opportunities? How are we growing? How are we reaching out? How are we passing the faith to the next generation and raising them up to believe? It's odd that Elijah dug a trench around the place of worship. There are those who remember that when we did the building campaign, we did dig a trench around the building and buried a French drain to keep the water out of the basement. But I don't think that's what this is about. Instead, I think it's about mission and how far we extend the perimeter of the church, how far we reach out into the world. This morning I received an email from John Dow, who's in South Sudan. John has gone there for a month to try to develop a new clinic site on an island where they've never had health care before. They have no electricity, they have no running water. These are all refugees from other parts of South Sudan who fled to the islands because of the war and now have settled there. He went to help set up things and to see what had developed, but as they arrived, they found a woman who'd had her throat cut to the windpipe. And they talked with the family and said, so we can stay here and do the things we're going to do that we had planned to do and watch her die, or we can put her in the boat with us, and she may not make it back, but we can try to get her to a hospital where there is a surgeon who can help. Realize it's a 16-and-a-half-hour boat trip, and they arrived at 8 o'clock at night. So they were going to be paddling that canoe all night long down the river. And they wouldn't arrive until noon the next day. But they did. And they got her to the hospital, and they got a surgeon who was able to repair her windpipe. And the next day, they saw her sitting up in bed, drinking her tea. That's how far the missions of this church have extended. There are members of this church who help to provide for that boat that's providing an ambulance where there is no other means of transportation for this people. What Elijah did was far more dramatic than what we've done. In a single day, he cleared the debris, he set up the altar, he called the people together, he put wood upon the altar, and then he declared this great contest. And to the 450 prophets of Baal, he said, you get to pick first. You choose the best bull, and you get to go first. And they did. And they sacrificed it, and they made an offering, and they prayed to their idols, and nothing happened. And they prayed to their idols, and they danced, and they screamed, and they whipped themselves, and they beat themselves till they were bloody, and nothing happened. And then he said, it's now God's turn. And Elijah took a bull and made an offering of it and invited the people to go and get buckets of water. Now realize it's been a drought for the last 3 years, and they each take large buckets and fill them full of water, and they come to the offering, and he says, now, pour it out onto the offering. And they pour out the water onto the offering and onto the wood. And he says, now, do it again. And they go to the place of water, and they scoop up the water and come back, and he says, pour it out. And they do. And he says, now do it a third time. Water is precious. Water is vital. Water is in scarce supply, and they pour the water out on the offering, so much water that now the trench is filled with water. And Elijah prays to God, not to consume the offering, but to turn the hearts of this people. That instead of following their own directions, instead of each working individually, trying to get their own way, that we would trust. We would worship God. Instead of having worship of our idols whenever we want, that we would have our hearts changed day by day. Our offerings seem too often to be like paying the bill. The reason why we have offering envelopes goes back to a day and age during the time of the Depression when you got paid in cash in a pay envelope. And you took it home and you divided it up, so much for the meter man, so much for the electricity, so much for the milkman, so much for the church, and put them in separate offerings. Our offering is not about what we give. Our offering is a giving of ourselves. It's like going to the Y every morning at 5:30 in the morning. It's not something we enjoy doing. It's something that we have to follow this discipline, because by doing so, it changes our posture. It changes how we see the world. We get stronger. We get healthier. We form a community of those who are working together. This is the place where you have come to be married. This is the church that you've come and presented your children for baptism. This is the place where you volunteered your time, where you have come to know friends, trusted relationships. This community is the church together, continually struggling, continually finding new ways. One of the wonderful things I learned about this church when I came here is that we don't have a prayer of thanksgiving in the worship service. Instead, we have a prayer of dedication, in which we don't dedicate our offerings. We dedicate ourselves. We are a gift to God. So the Soderberg children, each of you individually were brought forward to this church and baptized. And your parents stood here at the font and gave you to God. That you're a gift. You are a gift to God. They could never take you back. They've wanted to give you up again, I know, a couple different times. But you are a gift to God. And God loves you, each and every one. I love this story that comes to us from the Gospel according to Luke. It occurs in the other Gospels as well, but Luke tells it so well. It begins with, after Jesus had said all these sayings. All these sayings are the Sermon on the Mount. This is the Beatitudes. This is Jesus' sermon. And Luke refers to it as after all this stuff. And Luke, Jesus is continually saying something and then giving an example of it, living it out. And so after all these sayings, he gives the example. There was a centurion who had a slave who had done great things for the Jewish people. He'd built for them their synagogue. And the people, out of reverence for him, say, Jesus, you ought to do something good for this man. Do whatever he wants. And so when he says, would Jesus come to heal my slave? They say, Jesus, please go. Do what you need to do. But this centurion understands better their law than they do. Because as we read in the book of Acts the last few weeks, for Paul, who had been Saul, and for Peter, they know that to be Jewish is different from being non-Jewish. And the centurion is a Gentile. They cannot go into his house without being profaned. They cannot meet with him. They cannot talk with him. They cannot eat with him because he is a Gentile. So he's saying, don't come. But I understand about authority. Here I like to think about the film with Jack Nicholson in it, where he plays a general who's on trial, and he says, you can't handle the truth. What he's been saying is, I command people, and they follow my orders. If they do not follow my orders, they die. I command them to march, and they march. I command them to lay down, and they lay down. And until I command them to stop, they will march all the day long. That's what this centurion is like. He's one who commands and people follow. And he believes that if Jesus simply command, that this slave will be healed and be made well. we so often get confused as to what the instructions are. We celebrate Flag Day, but that's a day in June. We celebrate Veterans Day to honor all of our veterans, but that's a day in November. We celebrate Armed Services Day for all those who have been in the armed services. But on Memorial Day, it's not about us. On Memorial Day, it's about the widows and the orphans of war. It's about those who've given their lives for the freedoms we so often take for granted. This is not a day for picnics. It's not a day to put the boat in the water. This is a day to stop from everything we've done, to give thanks to God for freedoms that are not true in other parts of the world, that we've had a harsh reality to realize that life is not safe, but we can't go about seeking after what we desire, what we want. We need to trust. We need to believe. We need to follow where God leads us.